Okay, so we are now past the 1 year at Sinai. We talked about last week how the people were told, you're not going to enter the land, but your children are going to enter the land, and you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. We saw the people tried to take hold of their own destiny, and they said, no, but we will go into the land. And how'd that work out for them? Not. I like that answer. It did not work out for them at all. They got pushed back as far as Hormah, if I remember correctly. And the whole point was Moses wasn't with them. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't with them when they went up to battle, and God wasn't with them. And when God's not with you, bad things happen. And so now the children of Israel are going to be wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. I already had some comments on my very poor drawing here. It is very bad. I did it with the mouse. It's not a lobster claw, but if you look in probably one of the maps in your Bibles and you look at the wilderness wanderings, that's kind of the route that they think they took from all the things that we know. They kind of wander around, and then they come around the east side of the Jordan at the end when they finally get into the land. So that's what that is. And several people saw that. I appreciate that. But it's not a lobster claw, even though it's very poorly drawn. So we're going to be talking about the wilderness wanderings. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So in Numbers 15 and 16, Numbers 15 and 16, this generation that had come out of Egypt, they have been told time and time and time again by God, follow me, obey me, do what I ask, respond to me in faith, and everything will go well with you. But there were just some serious problems with that generation, because we see in Numbers chapter 15 and Numbers chapter 16, there are two acts of sin, because they've been given the law now. There are two acts of sin that are taken very, very seriously. In Numbers 15, I don't even know the right way to say this, but I think sometimes we view some of God's commands as being lesser than others of God's commands. And God proves that that's not the case at all in Numbers chapter 15. So in Numbers 15, if you look down at verse 32, it says, while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Okay, I mean, so just reading that right there, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. I mean, God said, keep the Sabbath holy, right? Okay, but he's just gathering wood. I mean, you got to have wood to have a fire, right? Well, this is a very big deal, because look at the next couple of verses. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation, and they put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. And then let's read the rest of this chapter here. The Lord also spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, tell them that they shall make for themselves tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, that they shall put on the tassel of each corner a rod of blue. It shall be a tassel to you to look at and remember all of the commandments of the Lord, so as to do them and not follow after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you have played the harlot, so that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. And so some people like to really separate what we read about the man breaking the Sabbath day from that last section. I'm like, you can't separate those two, because it might seem like he's just gathering wood. You know, you got to have a fire for basically anything you do in this time period. So he's just gathering wood. It's no big deal. Well, God's saying you need to remember what I've told you. You need to remember to follow what I'm telling you to do. You're going to be holy because I'm holy, and I am the God who took you out of Egypt. So here's just another reminder for them. We need to follow God. We need to do what he says. Any thoughts on Numbers 15? Okay. Well, right on the heels of that, I really think that Moses, who's the writer of this, is trying to emphasize that this generation did not have faith in God. Because number 16, we see another problem. We see Korah's rebellion. A lot of us probably know about Korah's rebellion. There's about 250 some chosen men and Korah and some others. They lead a rebellion because they wanted some of Moses and Aaron's authority given to them, even though the authority that Moses and Aaron have is given to them by God. They want some of what they have. They say that we're Levites too, so what are we doing? And the ground beneath them swallows them up and closes over them. The fire from the Lord comes and consumes all the people who are following them. And if that weren't enough, look at chapter 16, verse 41. Chapter 16, verse 41. If it weren't enough to literally see the ground open up, swallow these people, and close up after them, look at verse 41. On the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You are the ones who have caused the death of the Lord's people." Man, I mean, like, it's just time and time and time again. God is sending them message after message, and they are just not receiving it. They just don't get it. And so what happens here is that they grumble, and then there's this plague from God, and it kills 14,700 of them. If you look down at verse 49, those who died by the plague were 14,700, besides those who died on account of Korah. And so Aaron has to make atonement for the people, for the plague to stop. And it just really shows us that this generation that came out of Egypt, they have some serious, people would probably say systematic or systemic problems among themselves. There were things that they just would not get through their heads. They had hard hearts. And we could go to Hebrews chapter 3 and Hebrews chapter 4, where at the beginning of Hebrews chapter 4, it's talking about the people who wander in the wilderness. And it says the reason why the good news preached to them wasn't profitable to them is because it wasn't united by faith in those who heard. So if what they had heard, the law, if what they had heard was united by faith, everything would have been well with them. But it wasn't. And so we see things happen bad over and over and over again. Okay, any thoughts leading up to this section? All right. Well, let's skip over to Numbers chapter 20, please. Numbers chapter 20, because we almost see this cycle repeat over and over and over again. Well, in Numbers chapter 20, Miriam, Moses' sister, dies, and again, the people start complaining about water. This time, God says, "Speak to the rock," to Moses, instead of striking the rock in Exodus chapter, like he did in Exodus 17, verse 6. But if you look at Numbers 20, look at verses 10 through 12, please. Numbers 20, verses 10 through 12. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, "Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." And this is such an important thing, I think, especially as we're looking at the total plan for redemption here. I just wonder the details of how this happened. The previous time that something like this happened, God told Moses, "Strike the rock," and abundant gushing waters came out for over 600,000 people to drink. So, I mean, it's not just a tiny little trickle stream. I mean, this is like a river coming out of this rock. And here God says, "Speak to it." But Moses says, "Shall we make this water come out?" You know, that's a little bit different than what happened last time. And it says he struck the rock twice. And we don't know, we have no way to know if this is true or not. But why twice? Like, did he hit it once and nothing happened? He was like, "Oh man, what's going on? I got to hit it again." We don't know what happened. But because he does this, and God says, "Because you have not believed me or treated me as holy, not even you, not even Aaron will go into the land that I've promised." And so, like we've been noticing from the very beginning, you know, these characters that we see, they're just people like us. Not even Moses, not even Aaron is the solution to the problem of sin. They're not even the solution for the nation of Israel, let alone the solution to the problem of sin. But through all of this stuff, God is going to bring about the solution, which is Jesus. They are not the solution, but God will bring the solution about. Okay, any thoughts leading up to this? Not even Moses or Aaron. Okay. All right, so in Numbers 21, you would think after we're just going to thing after thing after thing that the Israelites are doing, that the people do, that show they have lack of faith in God. And I would think the next thing we would read is, "You don't have any faith in me. You're already wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. You all already don't get to enter the land. So let's have somebody wipe you out. Or let's have somebody punish you," or something like that. That's what I would expect. But in Numbers chapter 21, God gives the Israelites military victories. If you just scan over chapter 21, God gives them military victories over these people, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. But at the end of chapter 21, we see more complaining from the Israelites. God gives military victories to them, and the Israelites continue to complain. They're complaining about food and water. And this is one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament, because God sends these fiery serpents among the people. Fiery serpents, and many of them die. And instead of wiping these people out, God actually provides a way for them to be healed from being bit by these fiery serpents. So if you're in Numbers 21, look at verses 8 and 9, please. Numbers 21, look at verses 8 and 9, please. Then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a standard. It shall come about that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, he will live. And Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on the standard, and it came about. Now, if a serpent bit any man, when he looked to the bronze serpent, he lived. I mean, this is sort of a wild thing, but God sends these fiery serpents to punish the people because they're complaining about food and water again. But then God also provides the way for them to be healed by the very thing that they're doing. And so it's this bronze serpent, it's put up on a standard, it's put up on a pole, raised up, and if they look at it in faith, then they're healed. Now, one of the wonderful things about this, and why it's one of my favorites, is we don't have to guess this, that this is a shadow of Jesus. This bronze serpent that's put up on this standard where people look at it in faith and they're healed, it's a shadow of Jesus. If you look over at John chapter 3, and I remember hearing a sermon on this, and somebody, it might have been my dad actually, I can't remember who did this, but somebody preached a sermon and they said, Jesus is a snake. And you should have heard, it was like in the room, it said, Jesus is a snake. If you look at John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, we'll see this. John 3, verses 14 and 15. And this is when Nicodemus comes at night and wants to talk to Jesus. Look at verses 14 and 15. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whoever believes will in him have eternal life. Those are the words of Jesus. We don't have to guess that this is a shadow of Jesus to come. And so what Jesus is saying here is that Jesus, just like this bronze serpent, oh man, there's good stuff in this. So this serpent is the very thing that is killing and hurting these people. These serpents, these fiery serpents, and God says, make one in the image of a fiery serpent, put it up on a standard, on a pole, and so when people look at it in faith, they will be healed. Here's Jesus who becomes sin, takes on the sin of the world. He becomes the very thing that is killing mankind. On a cross, those who look on him in faith will be healed. And we don't have to guess that. We don't have to stretch at all because Jesus says that himself. So this bronze serpent in the wilderness is a shadow of Jesus to come. I mean, any thoughts or anything on that one? Okay. Very cool stuff. One of the unfortunate things about this bronze serpent that's up on a standard, later through the Old Testament, we see that the Israelites treat it as an idol. They take this thing that God intended for them to look to him in faith, and they turn it into an idol. And I've heard some people make the same comparison to crosses. You know, there's nothing wrong with having a cross on stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that, but some people treat them as relics or talismans, and if I kiss this cross enough times, then everything's going to go well with me. And even today, people are doing similar things. Okay, any thoughts on that even? Any of this stuff going forward? Okay. All right, so in Numbers 21, we see God gives military victories. The people complain about food and water. God sends fiery serpents and provides a way for them to be healed. In Numbers 22 through 25, we get this account of Balaam and Balak. And this is so fascinating, but Balaam is unable to curse Israel by God, and he blesses them instead. He was greedy for money, and so he kept trying to work around it. But God explicitly tells him, he speaks to him, and he kept waiting to hear something else from God. And actually, he enticed the Moabites to lead the people of Israel astray with idolatry and fornication. And we see that happening and described in Deuteronomy 23, but it works. It works. Balaam can't directly curse these people, but he entices them by their own lusts and their own desires. We know that because look at Numbers 25, please. Numbers 25. In Numbers 25 and verse 1. While Israel remained at Shittim, the people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab, for they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel joined themselves to Baal of Peor, and the Lord was angry against Israel. And so, I mean, we just see time and time and time again. God provides for them. God tells them what to do. He tells them what not to do. And this generation that has come out of Egypt just seems to, There is some hard heart situations here because it's just not working out. It's even so bold that while Moses is getting the leaders of the people and he actually executes them in verse 4, you can see that because they're just not good leaders. Look down at verse 6. While all of this is going on, like while Moses is physically trying to render judgment in all of these cases, look at verse 6. Then behold, one of the sons of Israel came and brought to his relatives a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the sons of Israel, while they were weeping at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So it's like while all of this is going on, while they're weeping, here's this guy, and he's like just waltzing the Midianite woman right through the camp. No problem, no shame, doesn't see anything wrong with what's going on. But we see that Phinehas or Phinehas, however you want to say it in verse 7, he actually, verse 8, went after the man of Israel into the tent and pierced both of them through, and the man of Israel and the woman through the body. So the plague on the sons of Israel was checked. And those who died by the plague were 24,000 people. Man, I mean, it's just time after time after time. What does God have to do to get these people to see who he is, to have their faith in him, and to obey him? What does God have to do? Man, it's a rough situation. Okay, any thoughts on this, leading up to this? Okay. Well, the end of the book of Numbers points toward Canaan land. Numbers 26 is a census of the new generation. And I really think that Moses, who's likely the writer of this, was very intentional about putting all of these details in, like, okay, this generation that came out of Egypt, they've got problems. And that's exactly why God makes them wander in the wilderness and why they don't get to enter into his rest, into the land of Canaan. So in Numbers 26, it's a census of the new generation. Numbers 27, it shows how even daughters could receive the inheritance that their fathers would have gotten if they had no sons because of their sins, and how Joshua was going to take the place of Moses. In Numbers 28 and 29, it's just saturated with sacrificial blood. And we talked about some of the sacrifices and the tabernacle over the past couple of weeks, so we won't spend a lot of time on that, but it's just saturated in sacrificial blood. And it addresses the problem of sin and points them back to the atonement that they need, that they can't provide for themselves. And then instructions are given for when they go into the land about which people are going to get which cities and which territories and refuge cities and all kinds of things like that. But the end of Numbers, it ends looking forward to this new generation going in and possessing the land that God has given them. So, I mean, as a whole, you look at the book of Numbers and it's kind of a bleak picture because they number up the people, it's a certain number, but then they've got to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because of their lack of faith in God. And even though God has shown them his power multiple times, they just continue to turn against him, turn against him, turn against him. And God is going to take out that generation so that the younger generation will go and take the land. And they're supposed to respond in faith. That's what they should do. So that's the book of Numbers. Any thoughts on the book of Numbers? I mean, we covered that. No problem.
Not only to reward wicked people with promises, but also the fact that he has to keep the promises that he's made this promise to Abraham, so that the children of Abraham, his descendants, are going to inherit the land. That is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And yet God is faced with this wicked generation of people who he's done so much for along this way, but keep spurning him, and he can't reward them with that. Mm-hmm. And he still has to keep the promise, and he does. He just waits until he has the right people to fill that promise through.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we definitely see his justice, his patience, because he will keep his promises, but not with these people.
Because he makes this curse earlier in the Bible where he says that the descendants of Canaan are going to be cursed.
Oh yeah.
Just like being a child of Abraham did not automatically make you a good person. Being a descendant of Canaan did not automatically make you a bad person.
Yeah, absolutely.
After vengeance on a wonderful group of people because he promised he'd do that. But you see, by the time that Israelites get to land Canaan, what are they like?
Yeah.
They're just as bad as they they deserve what's coming. So I don't know if they were always bad from the days of Canaan all the way down until that, or if maybe the same thing had happened there, if there was a waiting, if they were just too good, but by the time is right, God has both the wickedness in Canaan and the good, the holiness in Israel, and he can fulfill this promise he's made to Abraham.
Yeah, that's a great thing to bring up because we noticed in Genesis 15, when God is giving, it's actually a repeat of the promises to Abraham. Do you remember there's this line that's it's just sort of thrown in there, and I think we overlook it sometimes. It was in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here. But the reason why it was going to be the fourth generation, I'm sure there's many reasons, but one of them that God explicitly says in Genesis 15 is the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So God was patient with them. Obviously, they had some sort of law taught to them in some manner or way because God says the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. And so about 400, I guess it'd be a little more than 400 years later is when the children of Israel are going to go into the land. And we're told in Deuteronomy 20 and verse 10, actually, the first thing you do is offer peace. But with these specific groups of people, you wipe them out because of the things that they're doing. And we'll talk about that in just a second. That's a great segue to Deuteronomy, by the way. I appreciate that. Any other thoughts or anything? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That the faithfulness of God is just not for good things, but also when God makes a promise that if you do X, Y, Z, then you will get punishment. I don't know what comes after X, Y, Z, but yeah, for sure. Yeah, keeping the covenant for sure. And that's another great segue into Deuteronomy because we're going to see blessings and curses listed to the people if they follow him, if they don't follow him. And it's so many things in Deuteronomy. Okay, anybody else before we jump into Deuteronomy? Okay, so the book of Deuteronomy, it looks like this occurs over 2 months. And the way that we come to that, if you look at, let's see where this is. I want to say it's chapter 1 of Deuteronomy in verse 3. Maybe I'm going to get this wrong here. I think it's Deuteronomy 1 verse 3. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month. Yeah, I think that's it. The 40th year on the first day of the 11th month. But then you look down at chapter 34 and you look at verse 8. Deuteronomy 34 verse 8. The sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. And so it's this whole book of Deuteronomy seems like it's one giant sermon. And it's possible that it was parceled out at different times, but it just seems like it's one giant sermon from Moses, because we're going to see that in the second month, they're mourning the death of Moses after that 30 days. They're mourning the death of Moses. But here in Deuteronomy, it literally means like a second telling of the law in Deuteronomy. And so Moses is going to repeat the law to them. But I think in Deuteronomy, you get a different timbre, sort of a different tone from Moses than we see when he reveals the law to them previously, because he just pleads with them over and over again to follow the Lord, to obey the Lord. And if you read through Deuteronomy, you can feel very much that Moses is a repentant man who is sort of regretting that he can't go into the land with them. Because just time and time again, he says, give your heart to God. The words remember and forget not show up constantly throughout this entire book. So Moses is saying, remember what God has done for you. Remember what he's told you to do. Forget not all the loving kindness that he's shown to you. Don't forget what your forefathers did and how dumb they were because they didn't listen to God. He's just pleading with them because they're about to enter the land, but he doesn't get to. And so he is just pleading with them over and over and over again. And I really like Deuteronomy as well. I like a lot of these books. I don't know if you could tell. But in Deuteronomy chapter 18, Deuteronomy 18, this is going to be one that, Lord willing, I will mention briefly during the sermon later. So you'll have a head start. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15. in all of these pleadings and everything that Moses is telling these people when he repeats the law and what God wants. In verse 15, Moses says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you and your countrymen, and you shall listen to him. You shall listen to him." And now what's fascinating about this is we don't have to guess on this one either, that this is pointing to Jesus. We don't have to guess that at all. Now, those are my favorite kind, where there's no guessing, there's no stretching, no like risk at all. Because later on, like in Acts chapter 3, and you could read, I think it's verses 12 through 26, Peter is preaching and he says that this is Jesus. This is that prophet. In John chapter 6, when Jesus performs these amazing miracles, people are saying, this can't be the prophet, can it? The prophet. And Moses is saying, there's not going to be a prophet for you like me among your people, but there's going to be someone who's greater than Moses at one point, and it's going to be Jesus. And we don't have to guess that at all. I love that. And so when Moses does this, he points back to the problem of sin in Genesis 3:6, and to the seed promise, and that Jesus was going to be a prophet, and nobody would even become close to Jesus. And although, look at Deuteronomy 30, look at Deuteronomy 34. I love this line here, because Moses has just said in chapter 18, one day God's going to raise up a prophet like me. But look at chapter 34, and let's read this description about Moses. Deuteronomy 34, look at verses 10 through 12. 34 verses 10 through 12. "Since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all his land, and for all the mighty power and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel." Love that. Like, that is so cool. It says, since that time, there's not a prophet like Moses. Let me tell you, there has not been a prophet like Moses. And then we get to the New Testament, and Jesus blows Moses out of the water. As great and as wonderful as Moses is, and he's an amazing prophet right here. He's an amazing prophet. But Moses wasn't the solution to the problem of sin. Only Jesus is the solution to the problem of sin. He's a greater prophet than Moses. Any thoughts on Moses and the prophet and foreshadowing of Jesus? There's a bunch more shadows about Moses that we could point to Jesus, about being a deliverer, leading his people to the promised land, although we're going to talk about that more in Joshua because Moses didn't actually get to go in. There's a bunch of stuff. But any thoughts on any of that? Okay. I always like to try and look at everybody because that makes you real uncomfortable. I'm just kidding. That's a total joke. Okay, look over at Deuteronomy 29, please. Deuteronomy 29. And here in verse 1, we're going to see that God makes another covenant with this generation. And this covenant is different than the one that he made at Horeb or at Mount Sinai. For this generation, receiving, like what you were talking about, Mike, receiving the land is unconditional for them. The children of Abraham, the descendants of Abraham, are going to go into the land. That's unconditional because God made that promise to Abraham. But there is some stuff that's going to be conditional, like keeping the land is going to be conditional to them. So look at Deuteronomy 29:1. "These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the sons of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he had made with them at Horeb." I think that's really significant because this is in addition to, not just the same covenant as before. And here in chapter 29, and really the rest of this book, they must give themselves to the Lord in the obedience of faith to keep the land, or they will be driven out. That's sort of what this covenant is. If you follow me, if you are faithful to me, you put your trust in me, you will keep this land. And if you don't, you will be driven out. God even promises restoration to the people when they don't obey him and they're driven out. If they would seek him when they're driven out, then he will return them to their land in Deuteronomy 30. And that's going to be fulfilled later on when the remnant returns from Babylonian captivity back to Jerusalem and all that. But another really important thing I want to point out in Deuteronomy is that although Moses is pleading with these people, he uses the words remember and forget not over and over and over again. He knows something about these people. He knows something about what's going to happen to the nation in the future. And so look at Deuteronomy 31, please. Deuteronomy 31, and let's start at verse 14. This is sort of like, I don't know what this would have been like for Moses. Because this, to me, if I'm in this situation, I'm already feeling depressed because I don't get to go into the land. And this is sort of what I've been looking forward to my whole life. And he knows about what these people are going to do when they get into the land. So let's read this. Look at chapter 31, verse 14 starting. Verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, the time for you to die is near. Call Joshua, present yourselves at the tent of meeting that I may commission him. So Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves at the tent of meeting. The Lord appeared in the tent in the pillar of cloud, and a pillar of cloud stood at the doorway of the tent. The Lord said to Moses, behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers, and this people will arise and play the harlot with strange gods of the land, into the midst of which they are going, and will forsake me and break my covenant which I have made with them. Then my anger will be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them and hide my face from them, and they will be consumed, and many evils and troubles will come upon them, so that they will say in that day, is it not because our God is not among us that these evils have come upon us? But I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they will do, for they will turn to other gods. Now, therefore, write this song for yourselves and teach it to the sons of Israel. Put it on their lips so that this song may be a witness to me or for me against the sons of Israel. For when I bring them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to their fathers, and they have eaten and are satisfied and become prosperous, then they will turn to other gods and serve them and spurn me and break my covenant. Then it shall come about when many evils and troubles have come upon them, that this song will testify before them as a witness, for it shall not be forgotten from the lips of their descendants. For I know their intent, which they are developing today, before I have brought them into the land which I swore. So Moses wrote this song the same day and taught it to the sons of Israel. Okay, so imagine you're Moses. You already can't go into the land. You already know that you can't do that. You know Joshua's going to take your place. God says you are about to die. And then he says, by the way, these people who are going to go into the land, they're going to spurn me. They're going to forsake me. They're going to break my covenant, and I'm going to be done with them. And so chapter 32 is this song that we read about, like this song that should be taught to these people so that in those days when they're evil and they forsake me and all these things happen that I'm telling them that is going to happen, they're not going to be blaming me in that day, although they will. It's like they shouldn't be blaming me. They should only be blaming themselves because this is exactly what I already said is going to happen. And what's even more depressing, I think, if I'm Moses, is that in verse 21, he says, I know their intent, which they're developing today. Like it's not something that, okay, maybe give them 7 years in the land and then they'll start turning things in the bad direction. He's saying right now they're developing this intent and things are happening. Things are already in motion that they are going to forsake me. They're going to spurn me. I mean, does that hit anybody in the room? Like if you're Moses, yeah, these people aren't going to do everything that you just spent however long preaching this amazing sermon, heartfelt, telling people to remember and forget not and to give their heart to God. They're not going to do it. I mean, what do you think about that? Any thoughts or comments? Let there be silence.
Not necessarily depression, but this idea that God keeps his promises, even though he's not going to reward the first generation, he's still going to keep it eventually. But then you get to this situation where it's like, but you're going to lose it because you're going to misbehave. And yet, even after that, God still has to keep his promise. And so there still has to be a fulfillment of the promise of Abraham. And you do see them come back later and resettle that land that was promised. But then you see it seemingly lost again. And I think that's important because, for a lot of people, everybody who believes the Bible, whether they're a Jew or a Christian, everybody who believes the Bible knows that God has made this promise and it's going to be kept. And so the question becomes a very practical question. How is that promise going to be kept today? For a lot of people, it was like 1946 or whatever. You have this return to the Holy Land. But if you get in your mind that that's the fulfillment of God's prophecy, it has all kinds of disturbing political ramifications. Because people continuously look at math like what the United States gave to Israel over time and what territory they can throw out. Because the more conservative element there really believes that it's the will of God that they pushed everybody out of the West Bank, just like just like Joshua did, and pushed everybody out of the Gaza Strip, just like Joshua would have done for the bunch of Canaanites there. And it has a lot to do with how people see world politics,
Mhm.
and it's very practical because wars are being fought over these things. But so you have to see, is that really the way God is fulfilling his promise to Abraham today? And I think if you look at the New Testament, you see that that's not the way God is fulfilling the promise to Abraham, but he is still fulfilling the promise.
That is, I'm telling you, you're the king of segues today, because that is a perfect segue into this song, because we're going to see some details in this song that through their generations was supposed to be a reminder for them, is that the Jewish system, if you don't follow me, Israel, your entire system is going to end. So like there's a lot of people like what you're talking about who think that one day, physically Jerusalem is going to be where it's at, and that's where you need to be. And I just don't believe the Bible supports that at all. And I think we're going to see that Deuteronomy all the way on the left side of your Bible. You're going to see that it's not even going to end in Jerusalem. Okay, any other thoughts? I thought I saw a hand. Maybe I made it up. Okay, well, let's look at some of this stuff here. One of the things I want to say, though, there's the blessings and curses that are in the book of Deuteronomy. It makes it so much more impactful when you think about that Moses is told by God, they're not going to keep it. So like all those curses that I just mentioned, you can sort of go down as an itemized list and you can see those things happening later on. But look at, let's see, in Deuteronomy 32, let's look at this song that was supposed to be a witness for them when they disobey. Everything that God said he would do for their disobedience happened to the nation of Israel. But here in this song, I want to just notice a few of these things. Notice how many times God says he's going to consume them from the land, or that they would perish from the land, or that the Lord would destroy them and scatter them because of their unfaithfulness to the covenant. Okay, so I want to point out just a few of these here in Deuteronomy 32. So look at verse 5. Look at verse 5. They have acted corruptly toward him. They are not his children because of their defect, but are a perverse and a crooked generation. Who's he talking about here? I might ask that a couple of times. I actually need an answer. Who is he talking to? The nation of Israel. Yes, I got you. I heard one of them. So we really need to remember that, because that's going to be so important, because many of these verses are either alluded to in the New Testament or directly quoted in the New Testament, all the way back from chapter 32. So we're talking about the nation of Israel being perverse and crooked, being corrupt and not God's children anymore. Okay, look at verse 15. Verse 15. But Jeshurun, which is literally righteous nation, I think that's sarcasm here. Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You are grown fat, thick, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scorned the rock of his salvation. And so who is this? This is specifically the nation of Israel. Okay, we have to remember that Jeshurun is Israel here. Scorn the rock of his salvation. Look down at verse 20, please. Verse 20. And in verse 20, then he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be. For they are a perverse generation, sons in whom is no faithfulness. This is God talking here. He says, I'm going to hide my face from them, and I will see what their end shall be. Whose end are we talking about here? Nation of Israel. Somebody whispered it. I heard that one. I appreciate that. The nation of Israel. God was talking about their end that he was going to see, the nation of Israel. Okay, look down at verse 21, please. 21. They have made me jealous with what is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are not a people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. Okay, so now this is really interesting, because in verse 21, this is repeated in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 10, and in verse 19, does anybody remember what is being talked about in Romans chapter 10 and verse 19? Remember, in the context of what we're talking about here, God is saying that the nation of Israel will provoke him to anger, so he's going to make that nation of Israel jealous with a people who are not a people, and provoke the Jewish people to jealousy with a foolish nation. Who's the other people he's talking about there? Christians, yes, but specifically from where? Gentiles, yes. All the way back in Deuteronomy 30, we don't have to guess this because it's in Romans 10:19. And it's talking about the nation of Israel no longer being God's chosen people, and that salvation would be open to the Gentiles. all the way back in Deuteronomy 32. That's being foretold to these people. That's really, really important. Look down at verse 29, please. 29. Would that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would discern their future. So God is telling them to remember this song, that it would be a witness against them. Oh, that they would just understand what I'm talking about, that they would know what's going to happen to them in the future. I mean, that's pretty clear, right? Is there any thoughts on that one? Yes. Yeah, what their end will be. And some translations might say their latter end. Now, do we read about a latter end in the New Testament ever? We read it a bunch in the New Testament, in a bunch of the New Testament letters. There's a latter end that's being talked about that can't be the end of the world. So what latter end are we talking about? I believe from what we see in Deuteronomy 32, it's the end of the Jewish nation as that Jewish system and the nation of Israel being God's only chosen people. Let's keep looking at some of these. Look at verse 32. Verse 32. For their vine is from the vine of Sodom, and from the fields of Gomorrah, their grapes are grapes of poison, their clusters bitter. So in Deuteronomy 32, who is this being called Sodom and Gomorrah? Who is he talking to? Israel. Yeah, I know it's kind of a dumb question, but it's like so important for us to see this. God, way before all these things even happen, is calling them Sodom and Gomorrah. And now in the New Testament, are some people who are called Sodom and Gomorrah. And like, especially in Revelation, they're called Sodom and Gomorrah. And I believe that's the Jewish people. All the way back in Deuteronomy 32, we see it being talked about again and again. Look at verses 34 through 36, please. Is it not laid up in store with me, sealed up in my treasuries? Vengeance is mine and retribution. In due time, their foot will slip. For the day of their calamity is near, and the impending things are hastening upon them. Let's see here. For the Lord will vindicate his people and will have compassion on his servants when he sees that their strength is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. Here in these verses, whose judgment is it that the Lord is coming down on? Who is he obtaining his vengeance from? It's the nation of Israel. God would punish them and receive his vengeance and get vengeance on the nation of Israel for their unfaithfulness, not from people persecuting Jewish people, from the Jewish people themselves. And we see that all the way back in Deuteronomy 32. Oh, it's so important. Look down at verse 41, please. Verse 41. If I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on justice, I will render vengeance on my adversaries. I will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword will devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired leaders of the enemy. Rejoice, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants and will render vengeance on his adversaries and will atone for his land and his people. Who is this judgment that he's talking about? Who is that on? Yeah, it's the nation of Israel. There's a lot of people who are really uncomfortable with that idea, but I just say read Deuteronomy 32 in its context. Who is he talking to? Who is this song supposed to be a witness against? It's the nation of Israel. And he knows they're going to forsake him. He knows what their latter end will be. And so why is it in verse 43 that he can say, rejoice, O nations, with his people? Why is it that? I think it's the same thing as what we saw in Romans 10, and that's referenced in Romans chapter 10, is that it's the removal of the Jewish system, and Gentiles are grafted in, and salvation can go to anyone. It's not just the Jews. All the way back before they even enter the land, God is saying these things. I mean, is that surprising to anybody? Has anybody ever seen this before or thought about this before? Okay. I think a lot of people would have that same reaction to some of this stuff. What's amazing too is that a lot of these passages are quoted or alluded to in the book of Revelation, specifically Revelation 6, verse 10, Revelation chapter 19, verse 2. Here, before the nation of Israel even goes into the land of Canaan, God tells Moses, this nation is going to be unfaithful to me, and I'm going to hide my face from them. I am going to one day get vengeance on them, and they will end. The nation of Israel, them being my people, that's going to end. And now the nations will join. They will be coming in. to the system. And that's why the nations can rejoice, verse 43. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to go through that, many reasons why, but one of them is it's so important for us to realize in the overall scheme of redemption, the overall plan of salvation and God's plan that he's had before the foundation of the world, it was not a plan B. It was not an audible. It was not a last minute Hail Mary to just switch things up and, well, I guess the Jews aren't going to follow me, so I guess I better let these other people in. It was, I know all along, before they even went into the land, I know exactly what's going to happen, and this will be opened up to everyone. Not just that, I'm going to have a special people, but salvation would be offered to everyone. And it's so important for us to see that the problem of sin is going to be completed in Jesus for all people, not just Jews, for all people. And it's a really wonderful, amazing thing. Okay, any thoughts on Deuteronomy? It's good stuff. Okay. All right. Let's see, 9:48. What time is our class end? I forget every time. 50? Oh, 10 till. Okay. Well, since we got 2 minutes, let's do the whole book of Joshua, right? We're not going to do that. But in the book of Joshua, if you had to say like good or bad, just in general, Joshua, is it pretty positive, negative? Anything? Bueller? I'd say overall, the book of Joshua is pretty positive. There's a whole lot of conquest of the land going on. There's a whole bunch of good stuff going on. Obviously, we have humans playing a role in the things that are happening, so there's still some bad. But overall, it's a pretty good book of faith and commitment to God and to God's commands. If you look at Joshua 11, please, really quickly. Joshua 11. And I guess the first bell already rang, didn't it? Okay, I didn't hear it. Joshua 11. Let's look at verse 14, please. Joshua, or verse 15, I'm sorry, verse 15. And we'll read more about this, Lord willing, next week. But let's just read verse 15. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Man, that's a breath of fresh air, isn't it? And we've been talking so much about people not following what God says and God's vengeance and judgment on the nation and all that stuff. But that's a pretty good statement, right? That feels pretty good. If you've got a highlighter and you're not opposed to writing in your book, man, that's a good one. Yes, sir. That's right. Yeah, he heard that song and he should have remembered it. Yeah, great. All right, so Lord willing, next week we'll go through Joshua and maybe some of Judges or all of Judges. Thank you.